Well, welcome everyone. I'm Stephanie McDougall. I'm the project manager for the City of Houston Historic District Design Guidelines Project. And I'm so pleased to welcome you here this evening to our second community workshop with Nori Winter and Julie Husband from Winter and Company. Julie's over there taking notes. Nori will be leading most of the presentation tonight. And just really pleased that you're here. A couple housekeeping things, of course, set your cell phones to silent or vibrate if you haven't already. Restrooms are around in this hall. We will have a straight-through presentation for about an hour, and then about an hour of exercise activity, and then half an hour at the end for questions and answers. So plenty of time for questions and answers for you this evening. Let's take a look at the agenda, shall we? Okay, I'm going to do the introductions. Nora's going to talk to you about what their findings have been so far on this project. As you know, they've been collecting quite a bit of data, both just generally and from the community. He's also going to talk to you about some of the concepts and tools that we'll be using tonight and throughout this project, and then introduce you to some of the design methodologies and tools that might be considered for some or many of the historic districts here. And finally, of course, we'll have the exercise. So where did we start and how did we get to where we are right now? Nori and Julie came on board in May. They got their notice to proceed in the middle of May of this year, and they've spent really the entire summer gathering a lot of technical data from the city, from GIS, doing a lot of mapping, and a lot of behind-the-scenes analysis that is a lot of work that really you don't see, but contributes to all of the different documents and exercises and models that we've been showing you and will continue to be showing you. In the fall, we started with our meeting in September, our first community workshop, where we introduced these character areas. They were called typologies at that time. Really the different parts of the districts that are similar to within that area. We can look at the different parts of the districts and really see different trends in development. During the first workshop, we also asked about the issues, your goals for your neighborhood, things like that, and all of that input has fed into the worksheets that you'll do tonight. So very glad that you're here to do those. We will have those online, and please let your neighbors know the online exercises, because our timeline is tight, will only be available through Monday. So if they're going to fill those out, they need to do it this weekend, because all of that information then has to be analyzed and tabulated so that we can get out to you by January 9th the mailed version of the Visual Preferences Survey that will also be online again in the same kind of way this one is. And that's going to be available through the 27th of January. So you'll have a couple weeks to fill that out. Please tell your neighbors. We're also going to be doing a lot of public outreach around it. And in February, Nori and Julie will bring us a strategy paper, which will basically say, this is what we think you should be doing in these historic districts, and we want to get your input on it before we put it into the draft design guidelines documents. So it's a way to get input from you and from the Historic Commission and from City Council before they start moving all of that stuff into the final versions that will appear in come the spring. We're going to have another workshop in March where we'll give you an opportunity to ask questions about the strategy paper and get more information and your feedback on that. And then in June, we'll have our last community workshop, which will be presenting the draft design guidelines documents for Houston Heights, East, West, and South. That, as you probably know, we are mandated to finish in a specific time, by August. And after we have that taken care of, then we'll be proceeding with the completion of the other design guidelines documents. So the council has approved our bringing the completed heights guidelines to them in August. The ordinance, so Commissioner Kalman asks if that's a change, and it is. Originally, the Historic Preservation Ordinance, as it was amended in September, gave us 16 months to complete the design guidelines. However, because of all of the technical analysis and the different tools that we're bringing into this time, which is a little different than the design guidelines that we had done in the past, which were a little bit more basic, and could be because those districts aren't experiencing all of the development pressure that the Heights is. We needed a little bit more time to get that done, and so council agreed, and they've officially extended that so that we'll be giving them that in August. Commissioner Kalman asked how they officially extended it, and it wasn't through an ordinance amendment, but it is codified, and I can find out exactly how that worked for you, but we'll do that afterwards, okay? Okay, so that's where we're headed. We're in the thick of it right now, and the important thing is we get your feedback today and in January, very important, so that we have as much input from the community as possible going forward, okay? All right, so please remember, tell your friends and neighbors. There are a lot of different ways that you can participate in this. You do not have to come to a community workshop. We know it's very difficult for people to get out in the evenings on a weeknight, and that's why we're making everything available online on the project webpage. And so please, whether it's the materials from tonight, the visual preferences survey coming out in January, or anything else, whether you can participate in person or online, we just really hope that everybody will take the opportunity to be part of this project and make their voice heard. Okay, now I'm going to bring up Norrie Winter from Winter & Company, and if you have any questions for me or for Norrie, we are going to have a big question and answer period at the end. But we want to get through the presentation so that we can make sure that we get all of that on camera, and then I'll be also around to answer any other questions you have too.
Thanks, and good evening. Several of you participated in the earlier workshop, which some felt was organized chaos and others thought was maybe disorganized chaos, but you worked really hard, which we really appreciate, but what that meant was we had to work really hard because you gave us a lot of information. And some of that has been summarized in a document, a sample of which is on your table, and it looks like we may have some extra copies lying around the room, so if you want to take one from another table, you're welcome to. We didn't want to run copies of what we're going to show you for everyone. It is available online. We wanted to save a couple of trees. But there are enough copies that if you really want to, you're welcome to take them. We tabulated a lot of the information in the variety of the activities, and we'll walk through those very, very briefly, each one individually. But the punchline is what we heard from people participating in that workshop. There were about 100 people in that workshop, and then it was published online, and about another 50 people responded online. That's still a small sampling for this number of historic districts, but at least begins to give us a preview about what people are thinking. And the punchline is, when we looked at the models for potential additions and new infill construction in a variety of the historic district settings, resoundingly, people preferred the smaller additions or the smaller houses. Perhaps that's not a surprise. And on the other extreme, the really large models, generally people felt were inappropriate. But in between, things aren't so clear. Now, partially because it's a small sample, and also perhaps of the particular models that we showed. But nonetheless, that gave us information indicating we needed to dig deeper, to ask more questions about those. And that's what you're going to be doing tonight. All of the information we're going to be presenting first is to set us up so that you can test drive the draft survey that you each picked up for your district when you came in. That is a draft based on what you tell us tonight, and based on what we hear over the next few days, we will revise it for the formal survey that will be published and distributed in January. So you're doing the test drive tonight, and we really appreciate your helping us do that. So what were some of the things we heard out of that initial workshop? The first activity, people were able to just write down what they felt in terms of issues and related to their districts. And those kind of fall into these half a dozen or 7 categories. Some dealt with general neighborhood character, some dealt with site design, others dealt with the treatment of individual historic buildings, others were concerns related to additions, others related to new infill construction. Some were comments on the review process itself, how long it takes, or what it costs, or how clear or not the current criteria are when developing a design proposal. And then there were some miscellaneous ones as well. And just a few samples of some of those issues. Maintaining open ditches, which of course is a part of the character for some of these different contexts or character areas, if you will. Maintaining traditional parking locations, concern about loss of green space and mature tree canopy, maintaining existing building setbacks, and also, though, maintaining the diversity of architecture and seeing that the height of buildings was generally consistent with the character, with the context. It's funny, this screen jiggles, and it must be the suspension for that monitor. The others seem stable, but isn't this one just kind of moving a little bit? Or is that me? No, okay. All right. I'm glad to know it's not me. In the second activity, that was the one that was a bit of a challenge. You were asked to look at maps and illustrations and data about different character areas or sub-areas within districts that had development patterns of building sizes and lot coverage and building dates, etc. We got several comments and corrections, and we have edited those descriptions. We're not going to throw those at you tonight, but these tables reflect some of those edits. Now those character areas, as we're probably going to call them because we're finding that the word typology just is a little hard to work with, will probably help us define what makes a larger context. In some cases, people have said that the context as defined in the ordinance, which is basically one block on either side of the street, sometimes doesn't capture everything that we're concerned about. And how do we describe something larger than that? And the idea is that these character areas may help inform that discussion. In the third activity, people looked at a variety of models of potential additions to historic buildings and commented on whether or not they thought they were appropriate. Now this is just one-page fragment of a sample. The document with the blue cover has all of the ones so far that we have tabulated. So you'll be able to look at that, and again, that's going to be that is online. But if you look at this one set of models up here, and this one happens to be from Norhill, Model A, which is a modest addition to the roof on the back, 87% of the participants said that was compatible. And when you added a 2-story building to the rear of the original building, about 75% said that was compatible. When the height of that mass increased another story, half a story, the opinions shifted to the opposite. 75% said it was inappropriate. And when the addition got wider, 69% said it was inappropriate. That seems to indicate that height and lot coverage are things that people are responding to or sensing in terms of what is compatible and incompatible. we're gonna, the next survey draft drills down in that, and you'll see how we're gonna ask those questions. Similarly, new construction models, this one happens to also be out of Nor Hill. In this case, 75% felt that the one on the left was compatible, and it is essentially about the same footprint, and it's a one-story building in a one-story context. When a two-story building with a fairly tall front wall was introduced, 75% felt that was incompatible in that context. So here it appears that a two-story mass in front may affect opinions of compatibility in this particular setting. So those are the kinds of initial pieces of information that your work last time is giving us. One last one about new construction, and this one is out of Old 6th Ward. You will see that in this case, about 50% felt this building was compatible. Obviously, it's a little bit larger, it's a little bit different in form than the context. Maybe that's some of the consideration. And 75% felt that one that had a similar scale in front, but that had a larger addition to the back, was incompatible. Now, it looks as though perhaps lot coverage may be affecting opinions here. And again, we want to ask that more specifically this next time around. In the last activity, people looked at a range of photographs of houses, and we were asked, which of these would you find to be compatible in your district? And we just have a footnote here. Intentionally, we did not use Houston houses, not even, certainly not from the districts, but not from Houston, because quite often backstories about that particular house color people's opinions, and we didn't want to do that. Interestingly enough, there were only about 2 or 3 houses in that whole set of photographs that were one-story houses. Everything else, we were really focusing on looking at 2-story buildings and how they might fit in. But the most popular selection across the board was this Craftsman Cottage, 1-story. Interesting, across all of the districts. And the second most popular for many of the districts, not all, because some didn't like probably 2-story buildings at all, was this one. And what's interesting about it is that it has a 1-story porch that brings down the scale, and the length of this tall wall is relatively short. It's about 35 feet long, probably. So those were 2 interesting observations from the activities. So there's much more in there, and we're continuing to mine the information that is in that, in all the workshop material that was generated last time around. But next, that raises some basic principles related to historic preservation and preservation of historic districts that we wanted to revisit. There are several concepts that are embedded in the ordinance in terms of the vocabulary that is used, and some of those are the idea of historic significance for a district and for an individual property. And related to significance is the concept of integrity. Does a building retain enough of its original character and of its original materials to still be considered to be from that period of historic significance? And if so, how do you determine that? And part of that is in identifying what the key character defining features are for a historic building. And that gives you a cue in terms of what's appropriate to preserve and where there might be flexibility for alterations. And then the consideration of context, which is certainly important for considering additions and new construction, as we were showing you in those earlier illustrations. So what makes historic significance? There are criteria set forth in the ordinance, and they are basically these. One is that the architectural character, the style, the quality of the design is noteworthy. Another is that it's associated with important persons or events. And an event can be just the evolution and development of the city of Houston, and this particular neighborhood or subdivision, when it occurred, is a part of the history of the evolution of the city. That relates to patterns of community development, the way in which different parts of the city were developed, how they were laid out, etc. Those three are most often the variables, if you will, that influence historic significance for a district. But also, in some cases, there may be archaeological resources, and also it may simply be that it is valued by the community. It's a source of civic pride, and that's more often related to individual landmarks that are really noteworthy for some reason or another. So one of the questions then related to a district is, how does an individual property relate to that district, and how is it significant? And it has to have associations with that history of development, et cetera, but at the same time also retain its integrity. Now, in an ideal situation, buildings are all intact. They still retain all of their original features, but there are many that may have had some alterations but still retain enough to be considered contributors, still have historic significance. But there are others that may technically be old, but have been so substantially altered, and so much of the historic building material has been removed, that they're no longer considered to be contributors. That basically comes down to, does it continue to convey its historic character, and does it retain enough of its original building material? You will see that particularly being a consideration when you think about additions, and we'll look at that in a minute. So just looking at some quick examples, an intact resource, that most popular Craftsman Cottage is an example of what would be considered a building that's essentially intact, and ongoing good maintenance, good stewardship is the best approach for that kind of property. There are some in the districts that have suffered some loss for any number of reasons, some alteration that changed the character, obscured some of the original material or details, or actually may have involved removal or loss of some of that material. But they are still candidates for restoration, like this one. And so this building still retained sufficient integrity to be considered a contributor, and certainly a candidate for restoration. Now, this is actually an historic one-story bungalow. Can you tell it? Clearly, it's lost its significance. The form is obscured, has been substantially altered, and you can also imagine the percentage of original building material that's been removed. So that's relevant, again, when we start thinking about additions, but also just simply how we identify what key character defining features are for a building. One of those here is the form of the roof and the scale of the building, which you can no longer see. But that said, one of the things people have raised concerns about is, isn't there some room for flexibility for alterations and additions? Does it mean that everything has to be preserved? And the ordinance tries to address this, but there has been perhaps some confusion about where flexibility might be considered. Here's some thinking about that. This is a Craftsman bungalow, not in Houston again, but here it is, and here it is in its setting, a row of similar Craftsman houses, all developed pretty much at the same period of time, vernacular in some respects. Let's look at this building up close. You can see some of its key character defining features right off bat. Certainly the architectural details, these distinctive trim boards that decorate the edges of the roof forms, and the exposed rafter tails, the sloping shape of the porch columns. And it's probably hard to see because they do have an aluminum storm door and windows that are obscuring it, but you can see the distinctive Craftsman multi-pane upper sash as a part of the character, and some distinctive wood trim around. Those are all key character defining features for this building, and certainly should be preserved. As we move around to the sides of the buildings, of the same building, there also are, and they're still highly visible from the street, a distinctive cross gable form and a distinctive tripartite window here that's a key character defining feature. And similar on the other side as well. And you see them here in detail. But as we move farther back into the back sides of the building, and certainly to the rear, while that is original material and this building is intact, those may not be key character defining features in terms of the integrity of the building. There may be more room for alterations, replacement, modifications of some form, again in a compatible way, but this kind of an analysis and thinking about where the key character defining features are may help inform how we think about alterations and additions. Now, that's also important when we're considering additions in the context of the context area, which the ordinance defines as the block face that the property is in, plus that one facing it. And the variables looked at in the ordinance for determining compatibility are the overall massing of the building, its size, the general scale, how does it feel in terms of the way it's architecturally articulated and designed, the materials, the general character, which may include style, how much lot coverage is there, and setbacks. Is it consistent with neighborhood, with the neighborhood's characteristic setbacks? So these are all criteria that are considerations certainly for a new construction, but for additions as well. What we'll be doing from some of the other information you gave us is more carefully defining what the character areas are and what some of those key features are of a context. It may be the rhythm of traditional facade widths along the street with side yard spacing. Now this row might have larger portions behind, but along the street frontage, that rhythm, that scale is a key character defining feature for that district. In other cases, there may be a range of diversity, but it's a limited range. In this case, this is from Galveston, an illustration of a block that has a variety of buildings. They all have sloping roofs, but they're mixed. Some have gables, and some are perpendicular to the street, some are parallel. Others have hip roof forms. Another key feature is they each have a porch. Some are full width, some are not. Some are 2 stories, some are not, but everyone has a porch, a key character defining feature in this situation, and of course all raised, which is an important feature. Similar kinds of features show up, of course, in the districts here and are described already in some of the material that's online. As we think about additions in that context and in that setting, there are these considerations. One is the impact on the historic resource itself, and I've touched on that. How does it retain its integrity? Can you still perceive its historic character, its scale and form, even if additions are constructed? But also, what is the impact on that context area, that block and the block face, and on the district at large? Now, this is a sample page from the Galveston Design Guidelines. And it's beginning to illustrate some appropriate approaches to additions for Galveston and some that are inappropriate. Now, something similar is probably appropriate to develop here, but it's going to take some tuning to adjust to the different architectural types and the different historic districts and those different context areas. We're starting to do that. And so this is some preview of some material we're working on to try to explore what's the range of appropriateness and where does it step over the line of appropriateness in terms of additions. So these are some that are pretty easy. They're 1 story in scale, they're subordinate in size to the original, they're set to the rear, so all of those key character defining features that are likely to be on the front and the forward portions of the sides are not impacted. And in some cases, you can even more clearly see the addition because of using a connector. Those are ones that are almost universally going to be successful in terms of being considered to be compatible. There are others that are going to take closer consideration. It depends. It depends on the scale, the detailing, the materials, the location, a lot of specifics that we need to get down to. So we are exploring these kinds of approaches to additions, and not just to the rear, but also to the sides and also to the roofs. I'm just not showing those at the moment. But we're looking at all of those different scenarios and also spending time on the street learning from the neighborhoods in terms of what are the traditions for additions there that are a part of the historic character. But there will be some that we can probably say are definitively inappropriate, at least in certain districts, because of the impact either on the individual resource or on the scale and character of the context. So those are some basic preservation principles that are rolling into what we're heading toward this evening. The other thing is the tools that can affect mass and scale and perception of new construction, whether that's a separate infill building, new house, or an addition. And I wanted to walk through some of those tools, and there are a couple of copies of this tools paper, and we're going to hit some of those, not all of them, that are in that document. But you're going to be asked about these in the survey in a minute. And again, that full document is available online. It will be tomorrow. And again, to emphasize, these are potential tools. We're not at the stage of recommending which ones should be used and if they're to be used in every district or only relevant for some of the districts. We want to hear from you in that respect in terms of if these resonate with you. Some of them will be familiar because some of them appear in some of the deed restrictions and covenants for some of the individual districts. Some of them appear in some form or another in the ordinance or in current guidelines. One, though, that is particularly interesting is what is called a maximum building envelope. That's this blue tent beyond which a building cannot extend, or at least the key parts, the key mass of a building cannot extend. In the simplest terms, that is defined by the minimum setbacks, the front yard and side yard and rear yard setbacks, and the maximum building height. And within that, a building has to sit. You can, though, begin to shape that envelope. You can say it needs to slope in. That is, as walls get taller, they need to move away from their neighbors. They need to set in to more to the interior of the property. And so this one is a sloped building envelope, and not only that, it actually is stepped because it's in a context where the tradition is relatively lower in scale in front, and this is saying we want to keep the mass lower in front and step it back higher for any new larger building mass. Now this particular envelope may not be relevant, but it shows how you can manipulate a building envelope within which you can do any number of designs as long as it doesn't extend past that tent. Another tool that is often used is floor area ratio. That is the proportion of overall square footage of a building to the size of its lot. And in this case, we have a two-story building. The first floor is larger than the upper floor. The first floor is 1,250 square feet. The upper floor is half that. Combined, it's 2,000 square feet of floor area, and it sits on a 5,000 square foot lot, and therefore its ratio is a 0.40 floor area ratio, FAR. The concept is buildings are in proportion to their lot. Lot, smaller building, lot, larger building. So this is, again, a tool that can be used, and these obviously can be used in combination with some of the others. And here are three examples of buildings that all have the same floor area ratio, but very different designs. A one-story building that obviously occupies more lot, and two that have a combination of, this one has a combination of 1 and 2 stories, and this one is all 2 stories, all of them with the same floor area ratio. Another tool is certainly height limit, and we most often think about the maximum height limit, but sometimes the height measured to the midpoint of a roof is a consideration, and that can help to encourage sloping roofs, for example. But also the height of the wall, particularly at the minimum side yard setback, can be very important to the neighbor in terms of their perception of whether or not a new building is looming over them. And you can see that this can be a different way of approaching the same thing that sloped building envelope does in terms of encouraging taller walls to move away from the side yards. So that can be a key to compatibility in terms of building scale. Now, there's some other devices that can help to, within limits, not disguise, but help a larger building mass to fit into an area that traditionally isn't so big. And here is one of those, the idea of a one-story element. And that might be a porch, whether it's a front, side, or rear porch. It could be a front room. In some cases, there may be an entire wing, a bedroom, a living room, a dining space that's one story and the rest of the building steps back. Or a side wing that steps down in some form, or even a rear wing that may step down. Those are all ways of reducing the perceived scale of a two-story building, for example. And it can respect some of the traditional patterns in the area. Another related tool to that is a wall offset guideline. And traditionally, for a lot of these districts, any two-story building probably wasn't any longer than about 40 to 45 feet. And one of the things that people respond to in larger buildings is the fact that that two-story wall now is maybe double that length in some cases and can really be perceived to loom. So one technique, one device is to have the wall set back or pop out or have an inset. There are a variety of ways of accomplishing this, but what it does begin to do is break up the perception of the massing, particularly from the neighbor, but also as perceived from the street. So often this will be set to match the traditional sidewall length that is a part of the development pattern of that particular context. Now, one of the last tools to look at is lot coverage, and that is the percentage of the footprint, not the floor area, but just the footprint to the lot size. So in this case, we have buildings of different sizes in terms of square footage, but they all occupy the same amount of ground. And this is a measure, obviously, of trying to respect open space. It can relate to maintaining solar access. It can relate to helping with stormwater runoff, a variety of other concerns that we've been hearing about. Certainly one of the most straightforward is the minimum setback line. The front yard setback line, side yard setback lines as well are important. And those can be calibrated in different ways. Sometimes it's a fixed number, sometimes it's a range that is established by the range of variation of setbacks that might exist historically. Somewhat related to that is consideration of impervious surfaces. And now this may be simply guidance and best practices, but it is a concern that we heard about in the issues list that came out of the first workshop, was the amount of paving, particularly in front yards, that people were seeing. And so in some cases, guidelines may address the percentage of hard surface. Now, hard surface these days isn't always totally hard. So if you use this tool, then you sometimes will move to the next level of discussion of what are called pervious paving materials, things like grasscrete or blocks like this that allow percolation of water down through it. So that's all taken into consideration. But the fundamental question is, should we be looking at something that addresses impervious or pervious percentages on lots? And related to that is certainly parking location. That's a huge tradition in the districts, and they vary, but there are often very distinctive patterns that could be addressed, and this tool could be used in the design guidelines. So that is the end of the walkthrough of what we've been learning so far from the information you've already given us in the previous workshop and online, and the numerous comments that Steph has been receiving also, as well as a sort of a review of some of the key principles related to management of an historic district and treatment of historic properties that relate to our considerations, particularly for additions and for new construction that we're going to be addressing now. So, you each picked up a draft of the survey, and those are tailored to the individual districts. And we're going to give you time now to walk through those. We'll do it one step at a time. There are 3 pieces to it, and we'll lead you through each one of those. And we'll give you time to respond to each of the questions that's within those 3 parts. While you're actually answering the questions, we also want you to be thinking about, does this thing make sense? Do I understand the pictures? Is the survey, so answer the survey, but also critique the survey. And you can write in the margins or add comments about, this part doesn't make sense, or this works. That would also be useful to know, that yeah, I can understand this. So please think about writing in the margins as well. And then when you are finished, please leave it on the table. You each picked up a draft of the survey, and those are tailored to the individual districts. And we're going to give you time now to walk through those. We'll do it one step at a time. There are 3 pieces to it, and we'll lead you through each one of those. And we'll give you time to respond to each of the questions that's within those 3 parts. While you're actually answering the questions, we also want you to be thinking about, does this thing make sense? Do I understand the pictures? Is the survey, so answer the survey, but also critique the survey. And you can write in the margins or add comments about, this part doesn't make sense, or this works. That would also be useful to know, that yeah, I can understand this. So please think about writing in the margins as well. And then when you are finished, please leave it on the table.